So existing in my head is being present in the moment, and it's almost like a feeling that you kind of exist and that you are in this earth, you are in this world, you are in this plane, and that you're not just a floating thought, just kind of aimlessly going about the world.
What does it mean to be human? Is it found in our breath, the beat of our hearts, or in the fleeting moments of joy and sorrow? We are fragile beings in a vast universe. What does it mean to be conscious, to wonder? We are explorers of our little world and of ourselves. In this series, we look into this internal exploration. Questions with no right answers, only ideas of what it is like to be human, to express what can hardly be explained. We aim to send these explorations beyond our planet, into the furthest reaches of the galaxy. What will the finders of these messages make of our voices, of our questions? Will they see us as we see ourselves? Perhaps, too, they are searching, as we are, as humans.
It's a very big question, I have to say. I took some time to deliberate that as well for the past couple of days and weeks, and just what does it mean to be human? I feel like a big part of that is just the ability to, to be aware of your surroundings and yourself and your place within your surroundings. I feel like that kind of idea of consciousness, the ability to kind of internally and externally look at the world, and how you see yourself as well as your connections with other humans or other beings in nature, is probably the one thing that I really think of as human, as something that you're able to sympathize with aspects that are within yourself, but also beyond. I'm not sure if that's a very vague and very out of the box kind of way of interpreting it. But ultimately also the idea that we're able to coexist with one another despite differences, despite any kinds of clashes in ideology or in thinking and thought. So I think being human is ultimately a lot to do with how we emotionally handle ourselves and our conduct between other people and within our own, internally within our emotions. So I think that's one way I'd describe it. Consciousness. I think the biggest word to kind of encompass what consciousness is awareness. So the ability to look, to be aware of your surroundings, of the way that you act and behave, as well as having that ability to look beyond yourself ultimately. So consciousness to me is this idea that we are mindful of where we are in the place, where we are currently, where we are in the future, and where we have been in the past, and how we can kind of translate that into real life. So are we conscious of who we're interacting with? Are we conscious and mindful of what kind of behaviors we put out, and how we also how we find ourselves within our own body, within our own environments, and within the bigger, broader existential framework of life. It's hard to say. I suppose humor is something that kind of bonds people to each other. They always have some kind of aspect of relatability. So there's something that everyone can relate to, everyone can almost see themselves in. I feel like a good joke, for example, is something that people can easily identify with, or be able to almost put themselves in the shoes of who this person or who the joke is referred to. And I think humor is ultimately just the ability to, I guess, make people smile and laugh, right? It's kind of a reaction that you get from saying a phrase, from putting out a joke. Yeah, I think humor in that sense is that ability to connect with people in a topic that might be relatable or might be contentious even at times. I mean, dark humor is very controversial as an example of that. But yeah, I think ultimately humor is the idea of being able to connect with people on the basis of a shared experience, a shared narrative, and using that to connect with people ultimately. I mean, I love the fact that you touched upon the idea of humor changing, of jokes at some point having that power to bring joy to people, and that over time that can kind of reshape itself over time. Because I guess that also speaks back to the idea of being human, right? That you're able to change with developments that are growing, with new insights into life. And I think that kind of links very well with the idea of humor, that there is this development that we're seeing, that something that might be humorous back in, I don't know, 200 BC at this point is just fluff to us. We don't really understand it, or we don't really see why it's humorous at all. And I think that's such a beautiful thing as well, as being human, having the ability to change and develop over time, not constantly being in this static plane that we don't progress. Rather, we always kind of go upwards, hopefully for the better in all cases, and ultimately just not being in that static position of being stuck. Yeah. Oh, it's gotten very dark now, Nick. Like a very lighthearted. What is human? What is consciousness? What is humor? Actually, now let's talk about death. I wouldn't really know how to define death now, to be honest. I think what I've always understood is death as being as your last breath, the last moment of consciousness. Just your existence being, just the end of your existence. Not in the sense that your entire body or your entire previous life has just kind of wiped away like a clean slate, because obviously you leave a mark in the world. You touch people's souls, you meet people, you have connections over time. But I guess that's the meaning of what transcends death. Like, things don't just simply disappear. I think that was kind of the understanding I had of or in relationship to death, is that idea that things come to an end, that our physical body is no longer able to interact with the world, with other people, with the connections we've made in a physical sense, but that death also brings us to almost a new existence, that we have, for example, friends and family that appreciate our life as we're physically on the earth, but that they continue to appreciate and remember and have these memories that kind of transcend time. And the idea that our physical bodies don't exist anymore doesn't mean that we ourselves don't exist. So I think death, I feel like I'm trying to define death by thinking of death beyond death. But I think death is this idea that we aren't physically present anymore on the earth, that we aren't able to build these connections anymore or build new connections, again, because we're not physically present, and that our interaction with the earth has kind of come to a halt, but that we nonetheless have a place in people's memories, in artifacts, for example, art pieces, compositions. I guess that death isn't a permanent state of being, maybe in the physical sense, but not in the broader idea of life. Absolutely. I mean, I think that also just reminds me a bit of this idea of using, I think I read a while back that there were ideas of compiling information, like online information, chats, voice notes, and whatnots, and creating almost like a bot, like an AI, artificial intelligence bot that almost speaks like you post death, right? So being able to kind of collect all of this information and almost bring you as a 2.0 version, which in a way is terrifying, I find, to think that there's some kind of duplicate beyond my death at some point. Hopefully not, but also fascinating how information can be also used to almost not cheat death, but have that ability to still make you present in people's lives. I mean, I'm not sure how widespread we'll be having death chatbots in the future, but I thought that was really interesting. And also just that using of information of a person's data, for example, and applying that to artificial intelligence as a means to almost circumvent death or to continue with a person's life beyond death is quite an interesting thing. And I mean, I'd love to talk to this mass person, this physical mass person, because I'm not too aware of how conceptualized. Love. Not just a chemical feeling, because I cannot speak to the chemistry on that. I think love is a bond that you create with people. It can be romantic, it could be familial, it can be, romantic, familiar, just that ability to, how do you say? Love is love. This is very difficult for me, I'm finding. But I guess it's that ability to really connect with certain people or a singular person, and share and seeing, I guess, a future with them is something that I see in love. So like kind of being able to place yourself with this person in some form or way in the long term, in the short term, just kind of imagining a future, having that narrative of, oh, what if we did this. I always kind of see love as that feeling of compassion towards another person, irrespective of flaws, for example. Well, not flaws, but traits that you might personally find undesirable. So I think love in that way is kind of looking beyond. Yeah, it's the ability to cherish someone or something, despite anything that might come between it. So in a way, yeah. I hope that answers it. I'm not entirely sure. I feel like love's love. Because, I mean, I think oftentimes when I think of love, it is love towards another person, another being, so another living being. But I sometimes also consider love to be something that is almost beyond that. Because, I mean, we can think of, oh, I love this music style, or I love, I don't know, going on walks, exploring nature. So I think love is something that's so multifaceted. Like, it's not restricted to anything in particular. It's just your ability to connect and sympathize with whatever is external to you, but also self-love is such an important aspect, right? The ability to also look into yourself and say, oh, I love my hair, I love my flaws, I love the way that I speak, or I love the way that I'm able to share a moment with someone. So I think if I were to think of love, it's not just the idea of being in love with a person or another living being, like a pet or a whatnot. There's also maybe ideas. Like I love the idea of I don't know, looking out the window and seeing rain, for example. It's just loving certain experiences and your surroundings, and I guess oftentimes, again, falling into that consciousness idea of being in love with yourself, with your own being, but also being in love with who you are within your surroundings, within your environment. So I think that's what made it really difficult for me to define all of these terms, because there's so many ways of interpreting it, as you said, that there's so many things that also pop to mind. But I really like this conversation. It's making me think a lot about how I see words and the power of words, I guess, in a sense. A clock, first and foremost, I guess. I think for me, time is just something that doesn't stay still. It's not static. It's very dynamic. Time moves and fluctuates. And yeah, it just doesn't fall into place, as a constant. So it has that ability and that rhythm of moving, almost like a roller coaster, I suppose, like a loop or a wheel that you're always moving ultimately. So I think time, I mean, if you look at a clock or if you watch a countdown, the thing that you're always excited about is maybe the end of that countdown or the start of it, because that also presents a new change, right? Like when we think about New Year's, we aren't just excited about the end of time, so end of the year, but we're also excited for what's to come, so what the future might hold of time. So I think the way I see time is a state of change, of constantly moving, something that I've often been associated with, for example, is being restless. So the idea that life isn't just at a constant state of rest, that rather we are restlessly moving over, and constantly experiencing something different. So some things that aren't, that you might not be familiar with, or complete new change that is exciting or almost thought-provoking, or makes you kind of rethink and reshape life and how you see yourself in it. So the long story short of time, I think, is that it's the ability to change. So I see it as it's never a constant, but rather almost like a moving river. Change. I think the way I see it is being in one state and then moving to another. I see it as this idea that you have qualities about yourself or about a thing that doesn't stay the same. There's something that over time develops, hopefully always for the positive, but just that there is constant movement, that there isn't this idea that you're just standing still, or that life doesn't seem to progress any further than what it is. I think change in that way is this beautiful idea that we're constantly confronted with something new and something exciting and something innovative, I suppose, is also a nice word for that. And, I think change is also that idea of working from some kind of foundation, so that we build on the past or on some kind of previous base, and we build from that. Almost like, if I were to think of it in my head, I would think of like Lego bricks and just kind of adding layers and layers and layers over time. And so you change the state of being of this one Lego brick, and over time you make it into, I don't know, like I recently saw this great galaxy piece of a Lego galaxy piece, and surely it doesn't start like that, right? It has some kind of beginning and comes to an end. So I think that's like a really nice way of in my head, seeing how change is kind of having this base, having this almost default, and then working from that default, and then constantly adding something new to it, so that it's no longer that, or like you change the default over time. So say you have like a mannequin, like a naked mannequin, that is kind of the base default, and over time you add a cap to it, you give it some clothes, and it always constantly changes again what that new default is. So I think that's the way I would see change, just working from a base and then over time creating something new from that. So having new perspectives, new ideas, but they're always formed from some kind of shared, baseline, foundation. And like aging as well, I suppose, like the state that obviously I'm not the same person I was when I was 2 years old. My mind is far more developed. I'm able to speak more words. And it's also, it's again, but ultimately we come from that like one shared point that kind of develops and grows over time, which I think is really beautiful because you always have that sense of appreciation of how far you've come. Like, as you've mentioned, like the ways that you've changed sometimes surprise you because sometimes you have completely unexpected paths. I think that's the really interesting thing about change as well, because often you don't expect the change either. Like it's something that is kind of catches you by surprise and is almost like pleasant to think that we aren't the same people we were before, particularly if we've had certain regrets and mistakes, or even with mistakes and regrets, we also reflect back and see how that's shaped who we are today. In the way that I see it is how you see yourself and how you perceive yourself within the world and how you would like to be perceived by people externally as well, how you want the world to see you and how you interact with it. I think identity is the way that we can describe ourselves and be able to kind of almost place ourselves in the world. So that idea that we're very conscious that we are taking up space, that we are able to interact with things around us, and I think identity is ultimately this idea that we give ourselves a name almost. That I think names have this power to them that give us a quality of thinking where we are or who we are in the world, in the universe, in existence, and how would you say? And the freedom for us to also reshape how we see ourselves in the world. So I think, for example, I go by Rania, and that in itself has so many meanings and so much power to it because there are multiple other Ranias out there. But my own identity is a very individualistic thing, and that hopefully touches people's souls or connects with people in different ways, because ultimately the way that I interact as Rania is different to another person who might be named Rania as well. So I think it's the ability to kind of like place yourself in the world and almost, call out that you exist, I suppose. I suppose it's a state of being. Existence is being somewhere. It is... Wow, my mind just kind of disappeared for a second there because existence is that difficult for me to define. But I guess having a mark almost. So existing in my head is being present in the moment, and it's almost like a feeling that you kind of exist and that you are in this earth, you are in this world, you are in this plane, and that you're not just a floating thought, just kind of aimlessly going about the world. Like, you're making this really, really difficult of all these questions. But yeah, to exist is just to be in my head. I think to exist is to come to a realization that you're in a place that you are existing in my room. Like I take up the space, and I very consciously know that there are things that that are mine, that belong to someone else, that have some kind of place, that or they should be placed here, or they should be returned, for example. It's, I think existence to me is that ability to understand that we are in a place or in some kind of area, and that we form these connections of other places, people, and areas. And yeah, I think that goes towards like the idea of consciousness and being human, right? The idea of existence is also this big, broad, and scary question of what does existing even mean? Like, what does my existence mean to the world or to other places? Because I think sometimes we have this thing of existential crisis, right? Like, why am I on this earth? Why am I here? Why am I still alive at this point? So I think that that conscious idea of where do we find ourselves in the world, and how do we interact with the world, I think is what existence is to me. It's that question of how did we get to this point, and where do we find ourselves in the now or in the future? How can we place ourselves within that kind of idea? And yeah, I'm pretty sure I've had multiple existential crises in the past 25 years of my life, where it just really asked me, like, why am I doing these things? What is this for? What kind of purpose am I fulfilling? And yeah, I guess that also speaks to how we like goals, right? I think it goes to what do we want in life as well, is what I see as existence sometimes as well. Just kind of like what do we want out of life? I think is the big question that always comes with existing as well. I think it's not just simply being physically at a place, but also thinking very deeply about where you want to be in the future. There's no one meaning of life. I think everyone has their own subjective way of defining what life means to them. Because obviously I think that's kind of shaped by the different experiences that we've had, and just by the feelings that we are invoked as well from these experiences. I think the meaning of life is a very broad thing. I mean, as all these questions have been, just a very broad concept that everyone kind of interprets for themselves and has a different idea. So I'm pretty sure I think the meaning of life in my head is seeking out happiness, seeking out long-term happiness, and like finding a sense of fulfillment at the end of the line, aka death. But I'm pretty sure that the meaning of life to someone else could mean something completely different. Like, I mean, I don't really know if this is true or not for anyone out there, but maybe the meaning of life to someone else could be this idea of forming strong familiar bonds, or building a sustained long-term future of, I don't know. So I think meaning of life can be interpreted in so many different ways, which gives me that idea of it's a yes and no, that there is a defining way of calling what meaning of life is. Because everyone can have their own way of interpreting it, as you said. And it's also dependent on what people think of what life is or what it's meant to be. Because we obviously have different senses of how we see life to be. Like the good life, for example, is such a contentious thing. How do we know what the good life is or what a bad life is? I think it comes down to how we see ourselves and how we want to see our existence to be. Because I think in my lifetime, I have so many goals in mind. Whether I'll achieve them is another question, but I think that also shapes how I see the meaning of life, because I think it's formed based on the experiences and the ambitions we have over time. I think it's in the way that we want to meet certain expectations, or in the way that we want to build connections. So I think the meaning of life could be interpreted as anything and everything, to be honest, which gives that beauty of not being definable, I think. And maybe it shouldn't be defined either, right? Because why can we not just leave it be as just life? Does life need to necessarily have a meaning as well? Could it not just be a feeling of happiness in existing in the world, of, I don't know, sitting outside on a balcony and just experiencing sunlight? Gives me so much fulfillment in my life. And I think, I don't know. I think that is, to me, to answer your question of, can we define meaning of life? Yeah, I don't think there is a meaning of life per se. Not in the sense that like life is meaningless, obviously, but that I wouldn't want to label it with anything. I would want to keep it as open to interpretation and the ability for people to kind of tick box their own way of life. I mean, that's just the idea of giving power to words, right? Like, we don't know what the meaning of anything is unless we impose upon it our own definition, our own ideas on that, which means that like everything, like, words are a construct, I suppose, that we collectively agree these things have meanings, but in certain situations, like a meaning of life, it's so contentious, or rather that we value life so much that we don't want to simply label it. We don't want to box it up into this is what life is, right? Because I think that's the beauty of it. It's that we don't want to restrict meanings. Like, we don't want to restrict the meaning of certain, or the defining of certain words, because we don't want to say that this is the only way that you can have these things, or that you can reach this life or this goal or this ambition. Rather that if we leave it open, it also is able to kind of develop and change of time as well, right? Like, the idea that meanings also at some point had such variation with time as well, and with experience. And that we, again, coming back to the idea of like, we're not static. We're able to constantly build on ourselves and build on society, build on the world. That's what also kind of makes it difficult to define the meaning of life, because that in itself will constantly change, and we don't want it to be boxed into a static name almost, that doesn't have the ability to change with ourselves and with the world. I guess especially in the context of today and where we are right now, I think my aspiration for humanity is to be more sympathetic and being more, I guess that's the thing, being more human to each other. I think there are often cases or situations where we almost forget who we are and who the other person is. And so we act with a lot of anger, a lot of negativity, a lot of othering. And I think my aspiration for the future is that we're able to sympathize more, that we're able to kind of see ourselves as the same, but also different. I think that's the quality that is almost missing sometimes, that we see a person and we think, oh, you're so far removed from me that I can't possibly relate to you, and I can't sympathize, I can't act and behave a certain way towards you because you're so different. I hope and I aspire for the future to kind of not erode or take it away, because sometimes like differences is also something that is so beautiful. We want differences to be more empowered and fill up space as well. But we want to make sure that these differences also coexist together, right? We don't want conflicts to arise or tensions to build up because of these differences. Rather, we want them to almost work together. So I think the quality of sympathy and being able to emotionally come together as human beings is something that I wish and hope the future will be more mindful of. Because I think we just need more positivity, I suppose, is the thing. We need more, not to say that we never need negative things, because how else do we realize, or how do we have, because we can't have that, like, we need the yin and yang, so to speak. We need to understand that there are these things that happen to realize, or to almost appreciate life a bit better, or our existence a little further. I think, yeah, it would be great if people were able to be more kind to each other, I suppose is the best word to put it. And I think to not be so selfish, I suppose, is the big thing. I think as human beings, we are very often very inherently thinking of ourselves, or thinking of me, I, and what is best for me, and what is, or almost like self-indulgence at that point, right? Like sometimes we are very much thinking of how can we benefit ourselves as opposed to others, or how does my growth affect another person's is not that relevant. So I think it would be great for people to become more community oriented, I suppose the best way, that we are more open to realizing that we are not just living on the earth or in this universe as ourselves, but also that we coexist with other people, other being, other places. I think that's the thing that also kind of like comes back to, for example, like measures for climate change, that we should have more sympathy, or we should have more of an understanding that we aren't a self-contained being, like that humanity is not simply, doesn't just simply exist and not affect the things around us, that we have that agency, as well as that ability to move things, or invoke change and action in other things and create reactions, right? So yeah, long story short, I suppose, I aspire for the future to be more mindful, more kind, and more conscious of its place in the world.